Welcome to Founders Unplugged, hosted by Greg McCallum. Long-form, honest conversations with founders and entrepreneurs from around the world. This is part 2 of this episode. Be sure to check out part 1 if you haven't already. Link in the description.
Okay, and we're back for a part 2 of my conversation with Igor. We're just talking in part 1 about Igor's story, to entrepreneurialism, into founding his first company, the acquisition from Shutterstock. So go and listen to that. It adds a lot of context for the next part of this conversation. And then we ended talking about Igor's experience in his short stint in the military in Ukraine. And I just had one last question about that at the end of part 1, which I'd love to get from you now before we talk about what really sort of present day and kind of what you're working on now, which was just that experience. So you said that you kind of went off you went and you volunteered. I'm assuming because of some sense, because you're originally from Ukraine, some sense of I don't know, some duty there to your home country, but then you also volunteered to then go onto the front lines for a few weeks, and I'm just curious to know, that you said it was mostly out of curiosity that you wanted to do that, and for several other reasons, but do you feel like you found what you were looking for in a sense, and how has that, I mean, I would assume that must have changed or at least modified your perception of things, right, of life, and maybe given you slightly just a different perspective on things, or did it just reaffirm kind of what you roughly already thought of the world and of yourself?
It's a really interesting question, and to be honest, it's been almost two and a half years since I came back. I can't say that I reflected a lot on those 3 weeks in particular. There were kind of takeaways, generic, maybe general takeaways from just the whole time. But I guess, one thing that I certainly realized and carry to this day is how precarious life is. I mean, how quickly things can end, and they say it desensitizes you to it because you see it, a lot of death and injuries and so on. But it's more than that. I think it's not just that you see it and so you experience it, but it's more something within you changes. Something kind of, that doesn't break, but there's definitely, if you're able to overcome the fear, you kind of, in some ways, lose the fear of death. And that can be helpful. It can be liberating as well, because then there's just one less fear that you carry around, and so you become a little bit more free and able to do things. And the other thing I really realized is why people kind of do war tourism, let's call it, because there are definitely a subset of people that go from conflict to conflict to conflict, right? Like sometimes they're retired military who've done a few deployments and then they go back into contracting. It's the camaraderie of the whole thing is really quite unlike anything else. The amount of people you meet, but also the relationships, the depth and the extent of the relationship that you're building with people very, very quickly is not something that most of us, I think, experience in our 30s and 40s, because that tends to be the age where we kind of go back into the family and we don't meet a lot of people, and we certainly don't entrust them with our lives, and we don't deploy together. So that there's definitely a very interesting and a very cool aspect of that that I got to experience, and I could totally see how that can become very addicting, or at the very least something that you crave. And there is something about it didn't happen to us because we were kind of more of rural areas, but early on, people who deployed to defend the capital right when the war started, the city was empty, right? They were driving around in military vehicles with guns through the center of multi-million person city, essentially being a law to themselves. There's a lot of freedom in that. There's a lot of kind of anarchy almost that is really cool. You don't usually get to experience driving down in a tank with a rifle down New York City, where, you can tell everybody to get out of your way because you're defending, the city. And so there's something very, there's this very freeing, that you don't get afterwards, right? Like once you go back to the civilian life, you then have to obey the rules again, and you kind of just, become a person, and you don't get to carry your gun anymore. So there, that liberation that sometimes that anarchy that you experience can also be very interesting. So there are a couple of things that I got to see that I wouldn't have experienced otherwise, that I thought was really cool.
Yeah, and from a psychological background, because I mean that's obviously your prior interest, as it was mine. I find it really interesting what you said there, especially about the couple of things. So the one about the idea that, in your 30s and 40s, that it is true that, especially for, not to make this a gender debate, but especially for men, at that age, it tends to be where it really is the time of our life where we don't really make that many more new friends. It's really, we become a little bit more isolated, and we tend to focus a lot more on career and family, and it is far more difficult at that age to, as I know from experience, right, to meet new people and to form new bonds, versus, say, for example, my wife, who is a relatively new mother now, and so actually she's it's almost like the prime of social experience for women at this age, to meet other mothers and be introduced to new people, and they go off and they actually flourish there. So it's really interesting what you said there about that, and I never really thought about that as maybe a point of real kind of intrigue and interest for those in the military, as a pull to want to stay in the military. I mean, I knew that obviously that camaraderie was very strong anyway, but especially from an age perspective, if you've previously been in the military, let's say in your younger years, and then you go back into civilian life, I mean, and all of the challenges that holds anyway, but then you start experiencing age and the mundanity that can come of that, and the isolation and the loneliness that can come with that. If there's an opportunity to go off and re-experience that, I mean, I can totally understand why you would go, I mean, screw this. I can't sit in traffic all day and not, what I mean? Like, all my mates are out there fighting, like, what is this? Like, and you just become more and more isolated, not to mention all of the other reasons, the trauma and potential trauma and everything else. I mean, it's a really valid, interesting point, because I think a lot of the issue that men of a certain age experience, in fact, all ages really experience, is the identity crisis that comes with lack of purpose. And I don't think there's any clearer purpose than is experienced in a military environment. Like, purpose is very, very clear. It's like your purpose. I mean, yes, there's a broader purpose of serving your country, winning a war, etc., or serving someone else's country in this case. But the main purpose, at least that I understand from speaking with military personnel and ex-military personnel, is to look after the person next to you. Right? That's the bigger purpose for an individual. It's like, the person next to me is the one that that I look after, and the person on the other side is looking after me. That's a hell of a purpose.
What I found also quite interesting, and keep in mind, as I said, I joined when I was 35 or 36. So I had already built a company, and I sold it. So I wasn't, in a way, I wasn't a typical soldier, and I think it actually helped, because psychologically I was, let's say, more mature, more developed. But what I saw was, if you were young, if let's say you're 18 or 19 and you join the military, it really is a structure that provides everything for you. Your path is relatively clear. You're going to be this, and then this, and this takes 3 months, and then this takes 6 months, and then you're going to be this, and this is your next step. And so that's all very clear. And you're going to live here, and then you're going to live here. And okay, maybe at some point we're going to give you a choice of living here or here. But you're going to eat here, and this is what you're eating. All of that, the things that I had to figure out, as you say, purpose. Like, what do I want to do with my life? There, it's all very clear. It's all laid out. And so I could see how people coming out of that environment struggle, because I had to learn that when I was 18, 19, 20, to set goals for myself, right? Like, no one is going to tell me that you have to, go to university and do this. And it's all very unstructured. Then you can always drop out. And so I could see why people struggle coming out of that environment, especially in their formative years. All of a sudden, no one is setting goals for you. There is no purpose, as you say. And it's really, really tough to even figure out what to do, because you never really develop those skills. You develop different skills, but not those. So yeah, it's purpose and military. It's really, really interesting.
It is, yeah, and you make a good point. I can totally see why that's an appealing thing, because, like you said, that those formative years are so volatile. I mean, you're just coming out of puberty, you're looking at the world, you've got a ton of potential routes to go down, maybe different expectations, like you don't know what to do. It's the world is a scary place, but then to find that purpose, that can be very appealing. And I totally get it. And I think in a different life, I was very close to joining the military myself, because I was all over the place in my younger years, and in a different life, I can totally see how that would have benefited me in one way or another. And I had a lot of friends that went to the military for similar reasons. They were drawn to it because of complexities in their life, and they just felt like they needed that structure. But you made another really interesting observation too, which was about the fragility of things. And I think about this a lot, and especially when the war in Ukraine started, and then more recently the war in Israel and Gaza, which is that there is, I mean, more than just a fragility of life, right, on an individual level, which in of itself is something that I think people are very, very blind to until it hits them in the face. But a much bigger point, which is the fragility of society, that is taken for granted so much that society, people seem to have forgotten history. And, society as we know it, especially Western society, is built on blood. Like it is messy, and especially now we live in an age where everyone is trying to rewrite history to make it sound more appealing and fit sort of more modern day sensibilities, like, which is a stupid thing to do and very, very ignorant in my view. Like, what I think really isn't appreciated is just how fragile stability is in society. That it is, we're always on an edge that is very easy to tip over, and that what we have is amazing. Like, it shouldn't happen, and if we look throughout history, it didn't happen, like, for a very, very, very long time. Like, it didn't happen. So I think that's a really interesting thing, I think, to be aware of. That a country like Ukraine, that was really prosperous, that was doing really well and emulating essentially Western culture for a vast majority of its life, and still does embrace those values and so on, that it can be put into a situation like it is now and has been for a while. I mean, 4 years. I mean, I heard that on the news yesterday. 4-year war, like, that's crazy. It felt like just yesterday. So but I think it's just a really important, I don't know, that is a really important thing, I think, to bear in mind and to be aware of, that society it doesn't happen just by accident, and it shouldn't be taken for granted.
Hi, a friendly reminder to share this episode with your network, like and subscribe. And if you are feeling really supportive, please consider reviewing the show on the podcast platform of your choice. It all really helps support what we do. Thank you. Now back to the show.
It's funny you say that, because for me, I had exactly the same feeling. And I must admit that prior to February, I guess 24th, I think it was, I took it for granted. I mean, you grow up in peace and stability, and, people travel around and you go see things, and airplanes and, airports and all that stuff. It's all there. You get used to it. But I remember on February 23rd, I met up with a friend of mine in Kiev, and we went and had some tea in a place, in a coffee shop, and then we joked about how maybe we'll see each other in the trenches. The next morning, 6 hours later, the first missile flew overhead and hit a building about a kilometer from where I was staying, and that's it. At that point, it ended. That 30 plus years of stability of Ukraine and 80 plus years. I mean, there were conflicts in Europe, but let's say 80 years of Eastern Europe, and all of that overnight, all of a sudden, right? Like, tanks down the street. All of a sudden, there's no more police, there's no more judges, there's no more shops that you're used to. Everything's shut down, right? There's food, right? All of a sudden, everybody rushes to the store, and you end up just buying whatever you can overnight. It was literally 6 hours from the moment that you're sitting and just sipping coffee to the moment where all of that is gone. And that was the moment when I, realized, and everything all of a sudden is out of place. I remember, so we're standing in a grocery store, right? So people just grabbing everything at that point, and this was in the center of Kiev. So I mean, the situation where there's a war now, and I'm buying the last of French and Swiss cheese because all the local cheese has been bought, and like a Spanish like salami, standing with in front of me, standing this girl with like a Louis Vuitton bag with filled lips. It feels absurd at that point. All the things that 24 hours prior would have been celebrated and luxurious, all of this is just instantly out of place. You're like, what? Like, this is irrelevant now. You don't need a Louis Vuitton bag. You don't need French cheese. You just need.
And that's when you realize it's just an illusion. It's just a complete illusion. And I guess that illusion is shattered. But it is. It's just. And I think that's. I mean, that's what happens though when you enter into, and we definitely have, I think, this in the UK, and they have it in the States especially, where we don't really, the generation, the Second World War generation, has all but died, and there's a handful of people left that really experienced that moment in history, and what's lost with that is the perspective that they bring to the world, to society, which is that this took a lot. Like it doesn't take much. I mean, just in the same way that if we want to make probably a terrible comparison, but the comparison of building a company, like it takes a lot to build something, but not very much to destroy it. Like, and that's the key. It's like, when you build something on lots of bricks, and all you need to do is pull one out, and you find the right one and you pull that one out, the whole thing can fall. And I think that's something that we're in big danger of really not appreciating, which is why that there's, thankfully, a lot of voices in the world pointing out to people like certain ideas, certain ideologies, or certain ways of approaching things that are fundamentally dangerous to the fabric of society. They have to be pointed at and called out, because if no one quite realizes the history behind some of these things and how they can evolve into something that can be massively destabilizing and lethal, to society as a whole, right?
And as you said, it doesn't take much. It really doesn't. It's actually incredible that it went on for 80 years. But as you say, the price that we had paid. And I was exactly on the side of, do we even need military anymore? Aren't we post-conflict? I would have been against any sort of, military budgets and drones and airplanes, and, why do we need an F-35? So I would have been exactly that. If there was one more change that definitely happened within me is much more appreciation for for military. As you said, given the choice now, like when I have kids, I wouldn't be opposed if they join the military. Prior to this, I would have said, are you crazy? What are you doing? You're wasting your life away. This and that. Now, you know what? Yeah, it teaches you some very useful skills, and if you don't need to use them, all the better. And the military-industrial complex, I mean, you hate it up until you wish you had a bomb, right, that you could drop on the enemy. Or bullets to shoot your gun, and all of a sudden you really want that military-industrial complex built. So.
Yeah, it's funny because I look back at my youth, and I was a typical. I mean, I remember protesting the various wars and being with my hippie friends and believing on that. And I was fortunate enough, I think, to kind of come to. I mean, look, it's a nice idea, right? But that there is a realization that I think needs to be had, which is, as much as we don't like to admit it, violence is a very important part of the fabric of human nature. That there's a reason why we have the capacity for violence. It isn't just to be violent for the sake of being violent. It is to defend the things that you hold dear and that that you love, in response to other violence and in response to evil, or whatever it might be. That unfortunately not everyone holds the same values as you, and the only way to defend that, you're not going to be able to go up and give these people a hug. Like, there are people out there that just do not fundamentally believe that you should exist, and that's a reality that you have to face. And if you live in a world where that occurs and that exists, you have to have you have to have within you, either as an individual or as a country, the capacity for violence. You just have to. And that's something that, if I had said to my younger, like, pre-20s self, I would have said, who the hell are you? Like, what a ridiculous thing. We can live in peace and harmony. And, like, how ignorant must you be? It's a beautiful idea, but it's not based in reality. It's based in fantasy land, but anyway, I promise that would be the last. Sorry, go ahead.
No. I mean, we can talk about this a lot more, and for hours probably. But the one thing I was going to say, the last thing on this is, so one thing I've also realized from this, and you kind of mentioned Israel and Gaza as well, but is every country, every group of people really does need, in order to exist, they have to have the means of defending themselves, of protecting themselves, of making sure that they continue to exist. You cannot take it for granted that just because you exist today, you will exist tomorrow. You have to have the capacity to enforce your desire to live together as a country, in some way. And that's what, unfortunately, Ukraine is learning. And I think that's what Israel learned very, very well in the last, 80 years, that no one is going to really help you. It's always going to be ultimately up to you. Yes, you can have allies. Yes, you can have other people. Yes, they can supply you weapons and all sorts of. But ultimately, it's always going to be up to you to defend, to defend your autonomy. And violence is I heard this on the radio maybe 2 days before the war started, while I was driving in the taxi, and the guy said, "Look, Russians, Russian Federation thinks that Ukraine, should be part of Russia." I'm simplifying it, but they have this belief, and Ukrainian people believe that Ukraine should be independent. Well, it looks like we're going to have a war to figure out who is right, and unfortunately, violence is the means by which you can kind of figure out, when you have two opposing beliefs. Violence can be one of the ways that you resolve that. Otherwise, the whole world will always be in tension. And you'd believe one thing, I believe in another thing, and we'd just always be disagreeing. And at a certain point, violence becomes the means of, well, let's find out. Like, you think A, I think B. Let's find out who's right. We wish that it didn't exist, but it is a tool, and some countries and some people choose to use that tool to resolve conflict. And so it's there, and you can't. You have to defend yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think we all agree we wish it wasn't there, but it is, and that's the way of the world. I think one of the most underrated subjects in the world right now is history. For that exact reason. I think that I've certainly started reading a lot more history in my later years. I've realized that I'm very ignorant to it, and there's a lot that can be learned about where we are now from appreciating our past. But well, look, to switch gears a little bit then, because I said I wouldn't probe too much on this, but it's been really interesting talking about it and getting your thoughts on it. So you mentioned obviously the things that you're working on now. So I wanted to touch on that. So you mentioned that you're in the process of writing a book, but also a new startup. And you said something really interesting in part one, right at the beginning, when you were introducing yourself. You said that you've just I can't remember exactly how you worded it, but you've just experienced, that was it. You've just experienced your first pivot a couple of weeks ago. which I find really interesting the way that you phrase that, because it, that very clearly demonstrates to me that you aren't a first-time founder, because because you just know that there are probably going to be more, like the way you said your first pivot, because I think that's experience talking there, right? So, but anyway, tell me a bit about the book and a bit about this start, or I don't know what you can and cannot say about either one of these things, but whatever you can reveal about the book and this new startup.
Yeah, so the book. I had the idea to write a book, and I don't have a lot of previous experience writing books. I did write my PhD thesis, so that's, I guess, is a book. Certainly feels like one. I had a desire to write a book maybe in 2017 for the first time, and the idea came when I was there was a couple of people that our investor had brought together, and I was talking to one of the founders. And I mentioned that I had kind of parted ways with my original co-founder, and he got very interested, and he said, that just happened to me, or rather, I'm going through that process right now. It seems like you guys resolved it amicably. What happened?" And I kind of explained to him. And at that point, it kind of dawned on me that what I thought, when I was building data sign, I always thought that I was getting the short end of the stick every time. Like, if there was a good way that something could happen, and the bad way was always happening to me. And then I made all the mistakes, and so everything was just, anything that could happen was happening to me. And then I realized that actually everything that could happen was happening to everybody. That there is probably a list of, 50 things that can go wrong, and every founder will experience 45 of them. Their co-founder will leave, their client will renege on the contract, their key employee will quit the day before the project is due. Like, all these things will happen. But what is different is how people deal with it, and the outcomes. So somebody was able to have a positive outcome, somebody had a negative outcome. And so what I wanted to do is write a book that basically catalogs the different outcomes and different ways that people solve problems. And that was the original idea. It's basically almost have like an ontology of, here's 50 things that can go wrong. Here's 5 solutions, or 5 different ways people have solved it. As I started writing it, so I started writing it right after I basically came back from the front lines. And I was interviewing a lot of people, founders, to basically understand their founder journeys. And as I started writing it, it evolved a little bit. So my early parts are like that. And then it became more and more prescriptive, because there really were kind of better ways of doing things and worse ways of doing things. The book in the early parts is much more about description, and here's pros and cons of different ways of doing something. But as you get into later parts, like how do you grow a business, how do you sell a business, it became more and more prescriptive. So I had actually just finished writing the first draft of it maybe 2 weeks ago, and it's about 120,000 words. So it's about double my PhD thesis. It's about like 550 pages or something like that. So now I'm in the process of starting to look for a publisher. Although for me, that the publishing was never the goal, really. It was just, I wanted to write a book, and I just kind of started going through it. I think it's probably at least a year away from being ready to be published. There's a lot of editing to be done, but that's the book. And it's been a lot of fun. It's been long, way longer than I expected it to take. But I guess 2.5 years. And it's not finished yet. It's probably going to be more than 3 years by the time I'm finished. But that's...
Founders, do you know what keeps companies from scaling? It's not just funding, product, or even hiring. It's not knowing what your team is actually capable of. You think you know, you hope you know, but unless you have structured skills data, you're flying blind. That's why I built Peer. We run independent, expert-led skills audits that show you exactly where your team stands today, so you can build the right strategy for tomorrow. Upskilling, resourcing, leadership gaps, it's all measurable with PeerAudits. Scan the QR code on the screen or use the link below to book a free call and to get 20% off your first audit.
that's what it is.
Well, it sounds really interesting. I would certainly pick up a copy when it's ready. But yeah, the editing process is something that in of itself can be an incredibly challenging part of the process because of especially the more time that's given on it, that your perspective changes of your previous, and then you think, oh, I need to update that. But so it's going to be an interesting journey. But best of luck with that. I hope that you manage to get it out there. Have you considered self-publishing as well, or would you really prefer to go through a publisher?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess I'm not looking to make money out of it. This is really a way of giving back to the community and just giving my thoughts to people. So yeah, I've considered it. I think my first choice would be to try to get it published, even just to learn how that industry works. And then if it doesn't work out or whatever, then definitely I would consider just self-publishing it as well.
Yeah, that curiosity again is coming back, where you just want to see how that goes down, how that works. Yeah, I get it. And then so tell me about what you're working on now with this newly pivoted startup.
Yeah, so the idea was,
if you can.
I've always wanted to make batteries for iPhones, or for smartphones. I just remember, whenever I had a phone, or whenever people have phones, I was complaining batteries die too fast and not big enough. And so I just wanted to start a battery company. But this time around, what I'm trying to do is kind of build a business first and then fundraise, rather than fundraise and build a business. So the goal was always, okay, we're going to self-fund as much as possible. We're going to generate revenue, and then eventually we'll, get to where we make, build a factory and build batteries and whatnot. So the initial idea was to get a case, like a phone case with a battery in it, which have been done before, but kind of doing that, but slimmer, sleeker, lighter, better case, better experience, and so on. So I got a couple of co-founders who are engineers. And we started developing the case, and we were expecting to put it up on Kickstarter. So there was everything was going, and for about a year, we've been working on it. We already got to the point where we had the drawing, so it was going off to the manufacturer. We found a manufacturer, so it was quite advanced. And then, a couple of weeks ago, one of the co-founders goes, "Igor, why are we building a case? Why don't we just build a battery pack? Just the one you can attach and detach." And obviously, there's already 1 million of those on the market. But that kicked off kind of rethinking about, why are we doing this? So obviously we had thought about it, we'd done market research, we knew, why we're doing it. But here we are a year later, slightly different team, way more experience. It was a good time to ask that question. And that kind of kicked off a whole can of worms. And now it looks like we're going to pivot. And it's not final yet, but it looks like we're just going to be buying devices that have battery packs in them and selling the devices. And it's going to be a completely different business. So it looks like we're going to park the idea of battery cases and packs and focus on the packs and do something completely different. But as you say, pivots... I mean, data sign, I always joked, we became a pivot machine. I mean, we did it so many times, everybody lost count how many times we pivoted. So the team was actually so aligned on pivots that on Monday, if I had come in and I said, okay, we're not doing consumer app anymore, we're doing an API, there wouldn't even be questions. We'd just start working on the API. For me, and from what I've seen and what I've talked to people, that's just the nature of the game. That's just the nature of maybe the limitations of the human mind. I think when you're younger, maybe less experienced, you think that if you're smart enough, you can just figure it out. Like if you just sit down and you think about it hard enough, and maybe read enough and talk to enough people and write it all down, then if you're smart enough, of course, because you're not, then you're probably going to fail. But if you're smart enough, you just be able to figure it all out. And I, I don't think you can do that. I don't think it doesn't work that way. You start doing, it breaks, you fix, you decide that, and it's just a process. I believe in that. So to me, when one of the co-founders asked that very correct question, at first there's always resistance. There's always that feeling, oh no, let's just continue, we're so close. But then, the experience kicks in, it overrides it, and you're like, okay, yes, this is important. And then a week later, you're doing something completely different.
And it's funny you mentioned that, because I myself, as you know, I'm a founder, and literally later today, I'm catching up with my co-founder to discuss a potential pivot but not necessarily on the direction we want to take the company in terms of its offering or anything. At least not again, because we've already done that. But for our fundraising strategy, where we've been firing towards something with something very specific in mind for like the last 6 months, and then over the last week, I've just been having conversation after conversation after conversation. I'm just like, this isn't the right way. This isn't the right way. And it's funny, because if originally I thought the way that I'm going to be suggesting to my co-founder now was the right way. I was convinced to go one way, and now it's like, actually, no, this was wrong. I was giving bad advice, so it's the way it is. But I guess the worry that's always sitting in the back of my head, and maybe, must sit at the back of yours too in these situations, is, do I then undermine confidence in my ability to lead this company if I'm shown to sort of go this way, then go this way, right? Because it is a thing, if in leadership, if you're seen to be, moving from one direction to the other, that they don't have conviction in their ideals or their, goals. And that's always a concern. But I guess from my perspective, I'd be interested in what you think on this. From my perspective, I guess it's just it's down to how you communicate that, right? It's about how you put that across. If you do it in such a way that just very clearly explains your thinking, and you can back it up, to some degree with like, this is what we're seeing, this is why we believe we should go this direction. It reaffirms the confidence in that decision, whilst also putting your hands up to sort of say, to some level, I was wrong. That can inspire more confidence than just, being a bit bloody minded about it and not admitting fault to some degree. That actually a little bit of vulnerability is good to some extent. At least, I don't know, that's my view. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
It's always a balance. I think so many things in life are about balance, and you go one way or the other, and same advice doesn't apply anymore. So, for example, in my case, I, by my nature, this used to piss off my co-founders, was very, I wouldn't say non-committal, but very quick to change. So, for example, like we'd have a 5-hour strategy meeting on Friday, and we'd decide on a direction. And then I'd be walking on Sunday evening by myself and thinking about the meeting on Friday. And then I would come back on Monday, and I'd be like, this is all wrong. Like, we're doing it the other way. And they were like, but we already made a decision. What are you talking about? Like, we spent 5 hours on this. What are you doing? And then, so it would piss them off a lot. Because obviously, and this, I mean, it takes a lot of kind of thinking about it, but okay. So, the way you communicate is really important. So obviously you can't spend 5 hours on Friday getting everybody involved and aligning on the decision that maybe doesn't sit quite right with you. And that's why you spend the weekend thinking about it, only to then on Monday come in, throw away everything and just say, we're doing it this way. That you spend 48 hours extra thinking about something. You had a process, right? And that's how you ended up in the new position. They hadn't done that. So you're here, they're here, you have to bridge the gap. So that's really important. But if you do that too frequently, then obviously people go, well, I know. So they'll hedge. They'll go, well, the last 10 times that we made a decision, Igor then changed it the next day. So I should probably just wait for him to change. Then, so I'm not going to do anything.
Right. So then there's no urgency on things. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that doesn't work either. So it's a tough one. But in my head, it was always an advantage because, the other way of as you say, the rigid way, where you can kind of think of this stereotypical general that's been doing things the same way for 40 years. And so there's overwhelming evidence that this is not the right way. And he goes, well, I've done this for 40 years. So march, attack, right? And then everybody, the mission fails, everybody dies. And he goes, oh, well, I guess I was wrong. Or it doesn't even say that, or goes, well, we'll try again. Next line. And then he throws them, right? That doesn't work either, especially in the startup where, if you do that enough times, you're going to run out of money, time, and so on. So there's always a balance. Where that balance sits, I have no idea. Do you do are you allowed one pivot a year, or one pivot every 6 months, or one pivot every 3 months, or one pivot? It's really tough to say. The only thing you can kind of do is try to remove the negative, like the things that really get in the way. Like the things that are within you that are causing issues. Right. So if you're communicating poorly, fix that. It's not about the pivot. It's maybe about how you communicate. Or if you're too rigid and you recognize that that's harming the business, fix that. Don't worry about the number of pivots. Worry about what it is within you that actually causes issues when you pivot. Do you pivot too late? Okay, fix that. Again, don't worry that you're doing it or not doing it. Just try to work on that, where your mind maybe takes a while to catch up. So that's what I would say is it's about trying to fix issues within you rather than focusing on the timing of your pivots and how many you've done, and because they happen when you get more information or whatever, and you have to do it. You have to do it.
Yeah, and it's funny as well, because if I've been I know that I have a fault in me, which is to try and over explain sometimes my thinking behind something. So I go too far that way, because I'm so concerned with the communication part of things that I overdo it sometimes, to the point where I've had team members tell me, not just in this company but in other companies before, like, yep, we get it. You don't need to keep explaining. We get it. We're on board, Greg. Like you convinced us an hour ago. Like, let's go. Yeah. Stop selling it. It's like you convinced us, but I'm so concerned that there's going to be a miscommunication, or that my intentions are misunderstood or whatever, because I've experienced that before. I think it's also because I was raised in a family where of two immigrants, and we were very lucky. I was raised in a household where we always had foreign exchange students living with us, so we always have a minimum of like 4 people from around the world living with us. So communication and making sure we were understood was really, really important, and sometimes that meant explaining things several times. And I think that's still with me, in that, because of that environment. I experienced that right up to my adulthood. And so even now I'm obsessed with communication and making sure that point's been made and made well. And I still do that in my personal life too, like with my son. My wife tells me, like with my son, you made your point to him like in the first 5 minutes. Like if I'm telling him off, you don't need to then, I just keep reaffirming it. It's like, yeah, you're right. Like by that point, he's switching off. Do you know what I mean? It's like, so.
If you are enjoying this episode and want to support the show, please subscribe with notifications turned on, and let us know your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. This lets YouTube know we are doing something right. Back to the show.
Yeah, I think I have the problem on too far the other side, where it's like I communicate too much sometimes, which I'm even doing now, because I've just said that point 3 times. Do you know what I mean? I think maybe it works for a podcast format though, fortunately, but it doesn't. You know what I mean? And I'm so aware of it, but I just can't help myself.
I get it. I when I describe it, it's all about overselling, and the amount of salespeople that have talked their way out of a sale is probably just as many as that have talked their way into a sale. And I remember when I was buying the engagement ring for my fiance, there was this sales guy. There were 2 of them. There was this girl who was clearly less experienced than the very experienced guy. And the girl just kept talking and describing and asking me, how is it going? And how did you meet? And the sales guy, described the ring, and he just looked at me and he said, are you ready to buy? And I was like, yeah. And that was it.
Yeah. Keep it simple.
He knew.
Yeah. Yeah.
He knew that the customer is ready. just put a machine in front of him.
Yeah.
and that's it. And that's part of communications and sales is, yeah, exactly. It's done, and I do the same. I talk too much. And yeah, it's about knowing when the sale is done and just putting the machine in front and moving on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because, I have a sales background and I'm not as bad with it in a sales environment as I am with just, general day to day. But having said that, there is, my sales history, I guess, is very much on the fundamental framework of the consultative sales. So very relationship driven and so on. And absolutely, I think in the early part of my sales career, I suffered from that problem because if I was so focused on every deal needs to start with a relationship that I would occasionally didn't notice when I had a prospect in front of me which was just ready to buy. And it was only with some additional coaching and support. I was very lucky. I had some really good people around me that were just like, learn to ask just these fundamental questions in the beginning. And then that way you will learn very, very quickly if you need to go down that relationship building route, or, just basically ask, where are you in the buying process? Basically, that's all you need to ask. Like, where are you at? Where's your head at? And if you can determine that at the beginning, then Whereas, I think where maybe I should actually thinking about it now, I should apply the same technique to team members and so on, which is just ask them, right, okay, this is what I think we should do. Where are you with this? Are you going to need some convincing? Maybe that's all I need to do. And then I'll know, okay, right.
Yeah.
Give me 10 minutes and I'll try and convince you. But yeah, so it's weird. I don't do that as much in sales, but I definitely do. At least I don't think so. But I definitely do in the rest of my my life. But I'm trying to get better at it, and that's all we can do, right? Try and get better. But I wanted to ask.
That's the key.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, the delay the delay is getting to us. No, please go ahead.
As a founder, I mean, one of the things, like when you notice that I said, first pivot, it kind of triggers in you. The way I know that you're a good founder and a serial founder is because you know about your weaknesses and you kind of talk about that and you identify it. For me, when I was building the first company, that whole 6 years, 6.5 years, was all about becoming a better human being. And every time there was an issue with me, it was an issue with the company. It would always somehow manifest itself into the whole company. And a lot of the founder journey, I think, is just working, identifying issues with yourself, and then just working on trying to fix that. And that just makes you a better person. And better not in a kind of, I don't know, ethically better or whatever, but better as in more adaptive to the world around you and maybe more effective as a leader, more effective as a founder. And that just helps the business ultimately every time.
I actually believe it does probably have an effect from an ethical and morality sense too, because I don't think you can align yourself with values that make you a better founder without ultimately aligning yourself with values that make you sort of overall a better moral human. I've come to this conclusion over the last few years. I could be wrong. I mean, look, I haven't experienced a multi-billion dollar exit. I don't know what that could maybe do. It may be what you need to do in order to get there. I don't know if maybe that means you have to actually go a slightly different way from a morality. I don't know, but my assumption is, at least at this point in my career as a founder, that I still am maybe naively of the view that, in fact, in order to do and achieve those things that you say, where you do have to be quite self-evaluating and so on, that you generally will need to stay on the path of, I don't know, the righteous or whatever you want to call it, the sort of moral positive, in order to achieve what collectively a group of people need to achieve. I just think that those two things are probably quite intrinsically tied together, which is why I have this real issue with the kind of the enjoyment people seem to take out of hating founders and CEOs these days. Especially now we're looking at the era of what's happening out in the States and the cabinet that's been built of a lot of the tech bros, and the way they're labeled as kind of, and there's a lot of concern there. I can't think of a group of people who have been better prepared for having the interests of society at the forefront of their mind than a bunch of people that have gone through that and that have built companies that are generally, purpose driven. Because we've got to bear in mind that most companies are looking to solve a very unique problem, and most founders tend to value leaving the world in a better place than they found it as the first and foremost driver over the driver of money. Money tends to be a secondary thing. But again, I don't know what having that success and having that money for a long period of time does from a psychological perspective over time. Maybe it can have a negative effect, but I just feel like there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what it takes to become a founder, and all of what you just mentioned, and the way that the general public then perceives those people. These aren't people that were born into money or they didn't apply for a corporate job and then become CEO. You know what I mean? This is different. And that's not to say those people are inherently bad either. I'm just saying that if you were going to look at where someone could be more greedy and corrupt out of the two, I would think it's very unlikely that someone that's built something out of nothing and did it well would end up with that, because it just doesn't incentivize that. You know what I mean? It just doesn't. It's very, very unlikely, I think, you'll succeed with that kind of framework and approach to the world.
I think that you could probably do a whole podcast just on that and then unpacking what you just said. I for me, I agree with you especially on the part about so the way I kind of see it is, and it took a while for me to even understand where money comes from. But to me, it starts with value, right? So somebody, you need to provide value to somebody, and then they give you back, money as an exchange. So value, if you think about humans in general being good people, and I do believe in that strongly. A lot of the time, the best way to provide value is to be kind, is to be nice, and to do something good. If you start out inherently trying to screw people over or muscle your way in, I don't think you'll be able to provide value. So from that sense, I strongly believe as well that if you want to be an effective founder, it is about being kind, nice, and promoting the goodness rather than the badness in the world. So with that, I agree. I think also, as you say about a lot of money, I think at a certain point, if you have a lot of money, and I didn't get billions, but your perception, your interaction with the world, I think, can change. You may start thinking that because money, I mean, the way I saw it when I didn't have a lot of it, money was always a way of getting over mistakes. So I was in Germany, I left my keys in the house, locked the door, now I have to call a locksmith. Like if I had thought ahead, I grabbed the keys, now I just have to pay for it. And that's what money seems to be. It's a way of, I didn't do this, well, here's some money, the mistake is over. And I think when you have enough of it, you can effectively erase all of your mistakes. And that then means you're not getting any feedback. Like life is not punishing you anymore for making mistakes, right, for maybe thinking differently or whatever. You just able, let's assume that the buying X or Twitter is not a good deal. Well, guess what? If you throw enough money at it, or you have so much of it that is such a minuscule part of your net worth, that maybe for you it's not even a bad deal anymore. And so the signals, money kind of dampens the whole thing. And I think with enough of that, you effectively become detached from the world. You can't understand how all these people, are making all these mistakes. Why would you be on an unemployment benefit? Why would you, need food stamps? Like that just makes no sense to me, right? Like that, there must be something inherently wrong with the person, and that's where that detachment can come in, I think. And at that point, who knows what happens? But I do think, in general, people are very good and kind, and
No, and I agree with you. I think inherently that there is that, but then I suppose there's another layer, because of I would agree with you that I think that would probably apply to most people, but there is also a certain level, the experience that you go through in being an entrepreneur and founding a company, that experience requires you, as we've already just mentioned, to do a lot of um, self-assessment and a lot of critical thinking about yourself, to the point where you there should be a decent amount of self-awareness. And so I would like to think that even if you were to get to that point where you become potentially quite detached, you would be aware of that, right? Not to mention that a lot of successful founders are already intellectually or academically quite smart also. So I would like to think, and maybe this is a bit of idealism, but that rare combination of the experience of building a company in that way and all that's entailed there, combined with a decent amount of academic intelligence, should leave you ideally with someone that, even if they do start experiencing that potential detachment, that there is an awareness of that potential detachment, and they can make steps in order to not have a short-term memory, right? So that they can stay attached to that. That's what I think could potentially happen, versus someone that maybe didn't have to build something, that maybe they have it handed it to them. Not to say that that inherently is a bad thing, but it just, I think, reduces the chances of their having that longer term memory if and when someone becomes successful and that detachment occurs. If that makes sense, I may be oversimplifying it, but
Yeah, I think one thing that I noticed when I was building the first company, and I got to go to the Valley quite a lot, and I was meeting a lot of very intellectually intelligent people, right? Like PhDs in machine learning, and people building and thinking about the world. And I just remember looking at a lot of the engineers, software engineers, AI engineers, data scientists, and then thinking, they think they have it figured out. They have figured it out. In their worldview, if you have enough data, you can solve any problem. That was the thinking back in 2018, let's say, that given a large enough data set, you can solve world hunger, world peace, Facebook ads, whatever. And it always struck me a little bit delusional, that, or incredibly, I don't even know how to
it's
say it,
naive.
that these people are so certain in a way, but they're so certain, they're so smart, and they're so certain that they've figured it out, right? That's it. So if you just leave them alone and give them a big enough data set, there will be no more problems in the world. And I think that mindset is sometimes transferred over, thinking that you have figured it out. You just need to do X or Y or whatever. And if it's even reinforced repeatedly by commercial success of your companies, which is still a very particular thing. Just because you build the world's biggest valuable company, it doesn't mean you can solve world peace, or it doesn't necessarily mean that you can solve world hunger. They're still different things. But because you've done that, and because you've done it repeatedly, and because you're at top of your game, and because you're smart, and because you've worked on yourself so hard, maybe you do know better than all of those people who only said and did that thing, giving out food out of trucks. And I could see how you come up with that mindset, right? And that's then becomes the reality. And now a lot of these people have been given the reins to shape the world. I don't know. I could totally see why why they think they know how to solve all these problems.
Mm.
Will they be able to solve all of these problems? I have no idea. I don't know.
Time will tell. Time will tell. Yeah, I mean, you're right. We could absolutely do an entire podcast just on this topic. I think it's very interesting. And I would certainly keep going if I hadn't noticed the time. So you're lucky. um, but yeah, it's time to let you
I
go,
love
man.
it.
I will let you get on, because you've been very generous with your time already, and I really appreciate it. And of course, very generous telling us about you and having a chat with me. So thank you so much. But I will let you go. I will put in the description of this episode, and part one as well, your details, and anything else you want me to put in there. I mean, I'll put your LinkedIn profile in there. Is there anything else you want me to pop in there? Anywhere else people should go?
Uh, my LinkedIn is fine. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, if anything comes to mind, obviously send it over and I'll pop it in the description. But all that's left to say is thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I wish you the best of luck with the startup, with the book launch, and everything else that you're doing. And I really hope we get to catch up again soon.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for asking all these wonderful questions. This was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening and/or watching. Please like and subscribe, or if you are listening via podcasting service and want to show your support, consider rating or leaving a review. It really helps. See you next week.